Hello, I'm Emma Wallerton. I'm one of the tutors on the Jacked Greek Summer School. This video is aimed at beginners students, and it's aimed, as it says on the screen, at helping you read a passage in Greek. It's aimed specifically at those of you who've been watching through our beginners grammar videos, where you've been introduced to some grammatical concepts and you've practiced them using practice sentences. The idea is now to build on that so that you can read a whole passage in Greek. To that end, it would have helped if you have seen the following: Rowena Hughes's Introduction to Greek Grammar, Rosalind Axel on regular verbs and the verb Amy, I am, Ben Gravel talking about the accusative case and the definite article, Alistair Harden on the uses of the genitive and the dative, and Henry Cullen on the forms of the genitive and the dative, and John Dant on adjectives in os, on, or first and second declension adjectives. I've written a short passage that uses the vocabulary that's used in those videos in their practice sentences. There are a couple of extra words beyond that, but the vast majority of the vocabulary is in the videos. I've put the passage both in the video and also a PDF of it up on our website, and also a vocabulary list from the videos on the website as well, so you can use those resources as you wish. You might just want to watch the video and have a go at translating the passage without any vocabulary aids. You might want to have a look at the passage itself. In that passage handout, I have put the words that you haven't met before, so you might just want to look at that, or you might want to use the vocabulary list as well. It's entirely up to you. The point of this is just to get you used to the idea of how to read a passage and enjoy tackling a passage in Greek. So it's a good idea to do a few things when you're reading passages. When you first look at a passage, the first thing I would say it's really important to do is read the whole passage through a couple of times before you translate anything, even in your head. Okay, there are two reasons why I think this is a really good idea. The first is that a passage contains extended ideas. A sentence, obviously, it can only be so long, it can only say so much, but a passage, a paragraph, can communicate an idea, a concept, a story, a theory. It can relate to a conversation or a series of events. And so it can really help to think of it as a whole before you start breaking it down into constituent parts, because that whole could help explain parts of itself, as it were. Quite often you get to the last sentence in a passage and you're like, oh yeah, that explains the bit that I couldn't quite get at the beginning. So I think that's a really important thing. It's communicating a complex idea, so read the whole passage through for that reason. The other reason is that ultimately, when we're learning Greek, as with any other language, our aim is to be able to use it as we use all the other languages that we know. So before we sort of think, oh, what does that mean in English? If we just read it in the Greek a few times and enjoy it in the Greek a few times, that can help us get into that habit, and then eventually we'll just be reading the Greek and understanding it as we read it. So for those two reasons, read the whole passage through a couple of times before you translate anything. And once you've read it through, think about the sort of passage that it is. So quite often you'll be reading a passage from a specific author. Think about what that specific author writes about. If they write about history, you might have an account of a battle or of a debate of a political kind, or you might have a character sketch of a significant figure. If you've got a philosophical text, people might be debating and defining a concept. If you've got, say, one of Aesop's fables, you might find animals doing things that we don't normally associate animals with doing. So it's always a good idea just to think about the type of text that you're dealing with. Now, in this case, as is often the case with a practice passage, just to help you hone your skills, this isn't taken from work by a famous Greek author. I am very happy to admit that I am not one of the great names of the ancient Greek classical canon, but in that case what we do is put a little title at the top of it summarising the events in the passage, and so reading that and seeing what it's telling you to expect is a good idea as well. After that, once you've read it through a few times and thought about what it could be about, I would suggest thinking about how to break the passage down into smaller, more manageable parts, sentences and clauses. Punctuation will help here. We'll talk about a few ways in which we can help ourselves do that later on. But although the passage is a whole, and it's really important to think about it as a whole, obviously you've got to start somewhere, and breaking something bigger down into smaller tasks, smaller parts is always a good way of making it more manageable. So that's a good thing to do. And then as you're translating, think about what the words mean in context. Now, there's two important aspects of that. One is you might bump up against a word and you can't quite remember it and you don't want to look it up. But what might it mean in this context? What sort of things going on? Can that help you work out what the word means? And then obviously as well, the context may well affect the nuance of the translation that you want to make. So to be, say, agathos in a symposium might mean something a bit different from being agathos in a battle. And so thinking about the type of text you're reading will help you get that nuance as you finally translate into your target language. In this one, we're going to be translating into English. So one final thing that I always say about pulling together that whole, if you want to write out a translation, always remember that translating is taking something that makes sense and has style in one language, making it make sense and have style in another. So think about writing, translating into nice naturalistic English of the variety that people would say. And again, when you're working through, think about the type of text, the tone of voice that will suit translation of a passage from a historical text will be different from the sort of tone of voice you'd use if you were translating a fable. So think about those sorts of things. Okay, so here is your passage. As you can see, it's called Athena Surprises a Good Messenger. As I said, there are a couple of words in there that haven't cropped up in the practice videos that I listed at the start. Those are these words here, eremos and exaipnes. I won't tell you what they mean right now. As I say, you can look them up if you want to, or you can try to work them out. You may well be able to work them out from the context. But there is one type of word that I want to highlight that you haven't met in your sentences. I'll just make those go bold now. These are these short words, men, that delta by itself is in fact de, delta, epsilon, and chi. Now these words are all what we call particles. Particles do a number of jobs in Greek. One is they tell us things like tone of voice. So for example, the word de, not what you have with that de there, that's delta epsilon, but delta eta, de, that really emphasizes the word it goes before. So soper, she's wise, soper de, she's really seriously wise. In this passage, those particles are acting as conjunctions. Got excited and told you before I'd actually finished my sentence there. And that's another thing that particles can do, act as joining words, joining clauses to one another to turn them into sentences, or joining sentences to one another to turn them into paragraphs. And that's what those conjunctions are doing in the story primarily. The men and the de in the first sentence is doing a little bit more than that, and we'll discuss that in a little bit. Again, you may be able to work out just from the context of the passage what it is that it's doing. So I won't spoiler it for you now. So I'm just going to leave you to pause the video if you want to tackle the passage, and then after that I will read it out in Greek and then I will talk through how to translate it. So first off, as I said, I will read this out in Greek. Athena surprises a good messenger. Enagroi estin angelos agathos. Homen angelos ponen akue. Hodagros estin eremos. Kai kale estin he poner. Exaipnes den agroi estit thea. Estin he Athena. Hod angelos ten thean taumazde. Kai he Athena lege. Aner kalos kai agathosei. Kai dura toi angeloi pareke. So there we have it in Greek. I said you should probably read it a couple of times. I will not read it multiple times in Greek, don't worry. But let's think about how we could first of all break that whole down into manageable parts. We know it's about Athena surprising a good messenger, and we've seen Athena's name cropping up at the end. So we've got a sense of the shape of the whole of it, but how can we break it down into smaller tasks, as it were, to work our way through? Well, a really useful thing to do is just to look at punctuation, find the full stops. So I've put a line next to all the full stops there. Yeah, full stop. Full stops are used in our texts of Greek just as in the same way as they're used in the text of most languages to mark the end of a sentence. So you know you've got an end of a sentence there. Another useful punctuation mark that isn't the same in our Greek text as it is in English is towards the bottom of the slide, after the fourth word in the penultimate line. You've got that dot in the middle of the line, which I think is actually technically called a mid-dot. That's what we use in Greek texts instead of a semicolon or a colon. The symbol that we use as a semicolon in quite a lot of languages in Greek is used as a question mark. So to replace it or to replace a colon, this mid-dot is used. And again, that will mark off probably a sense unit, so it can be really helpful to spot that. Another thing it can be helpful to do, look for your verbs. Verbs are what make a clause, as it were, and so if you can see how many verbs you've got, you can see how many sort of sense units you're dealing with. And also as well, it can be helpful to look for those particles that I mentioned earlier, those conjunction particles that I brought up in bold earlier on the screen. So now let's go through this sentence by sentence and work out what it means. So here is our first sentence. En agroi estin angelos agathos. So my first word, en. I know that's a preposition and I know it takes a dative. Learn that from, for example, Alistair's video. So do I have a dative? Well, fortunately, yes, I've got a dative right next to it. And that's very often the case with prepositions. The words that they're governing, the words that we translate them with, are very, very close to them indeed. And here we've got them right next to one another. En agroi. Agroi from agros, related to the Latin word ager, from which we get the English word agriculture, so it means a field. Estin, we recognise as the third person singular of the verb to be, he, she, or it is. So that means we're probably going to have a singular subject. We might have a plural subject if we have a neuter subject, because if you remember, neuter plural nouns take singular verbs. You always find them with singular verbs. So if we have a neuter subject, we could be looking for a plural subject. But in fact, if we look through our next two words, angelos and agathos, we've got a singular subject, the angelos, the messenger. That's where we get the English word angel from. And he's being described as agathos, good, which is also a hint that was given in the title. So they're both masculine singular nominative. They're the subject of our verb. And the en agroi, the prepositional phrase, is telling us where all of this is happening. In a field is a good messenger. Our next sentence. Ho men angelos ponen akue, ho dagros estin eremos. So let's have a look through that. Well, we've got men and de, as I said, that de is de, delta, epsilon. Now that particular pair of particles work together in a specific way. You may have worked this out from the context if you thought about what it meant. They draw a contrast between the two clauses that each of them is in. So you've got men, one thing, de, another thing. Often you see them listed in vocabulary books and textbooks as meaning something like, as meaning on the one hand for men and on the other for de. And that's a useful sort of shorthand way of remembering what they're doing, but it is quite clumsy English. We don't tend to talk like that or use those sorts of phrases in most day-to-day or indeed most formal English context. So we're probably not going to want to retain that in our translation, but we're going to want to sort of think about the idea that on the one hand, on the other hand, contains that idea of contrast. Another little thing to note about men and de is that they are what we call post-positives. Technical word simply means that they can't come first in a sentence. They're normally the second word in their sentence or clause. And so what you can see happening on the screen there with them popping up in between the article and the noun, ho men angelos, ho de agros, is really common. And that might be one way in which preposition gets separated from the noun that it's governing, for example. So if we'd had a de in the previous sentence, we'd have had en de agroi, something along those lines. So you've got ho men angelos ponen akue, hod de agros estin eremos, a contrast of some description. Now we've got two verbs if we look at that sentence, ho men angelos ponen akue and hod de agros estin eremos, akue and estin. So we could very well, and indeed, as we look, we can see we will have two subjects. We might just have one. You can have the same subject for multiple verbs occurring frequently in the first clause and then just being expected to be understood as you go through the rest of the clauses. So be aware of that. It may be that when you hit a new verb, you don't necessarily get a new subject. But in this case, we do in fact have two subjects. We've got hot angelos in our first clause and hot agros in our second clause. So the subject of the first verb is in that first clause before the comma. Hot angelos is subject of akue, whereas the subject of our second verb is after the comma. Hot agros is the subject of estin. We have two more component parts of our sentence to deal with. We've got ponen and we've got eremos. So ponen, first of all, let's have a think about that. That's a noun. It's a singular noun, it's feminine. I remember my first declension forms, that's an accusative noun. What do accusatives normally do? Well, their main role in Greek sentences is that they're the direct object of the verb. So any verb that describes an action that you can perform on something can govern an accusative, usually governs an accusative in Greek. We call those verbs transitive verbs. And so here, akuo can govern a direct object. So ponen there is going to be its object. And what about eremos? Hoda agros estin eremos. Estin isn't a verb that can govern an accusative. It's not a transitive verb. So eremos, thankfully, isn't accusative. It wouldn't work if it were. Eremos is masculine, singular, nominative. It's agreeing with agros. And this is quite a common type of sentence to get with estin, verb to be, a description telling you something about the subject of the verb to be. So in the second clause, eremos agrees with agros. They're both masculine, nominative, singular. And so that sentence means the messenger hears, akue, get the word acoustics from that, a voice, poner, but the field is deserted, eremos. And so you can see on the screen there how I've dealt with that men and der. Remember, we were thinking about that literally as on the one hand, the messenger hears a voice, but on the other hand, the field is empty or deserted. But that isn't really very natural English, and you quite often find yourself with men and der not really translating the men and then translating the der as a but. Another way that you can quite easily handle it into good naturalistic English would be is to think of the men as a while and then just ignore the der. So while the messenger hears a voice, the field is empty. Here I think the but works a bit better for the English sense. So the messenger hears a voice, but the field is deserted. Kai kale estin he poner is our next sentence. So kai is one of these particles that act as a conjunction. It's a very common conjunction. It simply means and, joining on our next sentence. And kale is our next word. Now kale, I remember, is an adjective, kalos, kale, kalon. And so one thing that I might want to think to myself that's been mentioned a couple of times is, does it have an article with it? Because you remember, if an adjective has an article with it, it can turn it into a noun. You could have hair kale, the feminine singular, beautiful thing, probably therefore the beautiful woman, something along those lines. But here kale doesn't have an article with it, so it isn't our subject. It's simply a feminine nominative singular adjective. So we're still looking for our subject. Then we see the verb to be, estin again. So we know we're looking for a singular subject. How do we know that for certain? Well, kale is nominative, kale is singular, so we're looking for a feminine nominative singular subject. Kale estin, it's a describing clause, so we need something that it's going to be describing. Unfortunately, we have a he poner in the feminine nominative singular. Kale therefore agrees with it. So, and the voice is beautiful. So our story so far in a field is a good messenger. The messenger hears a voice, but the field is deserted, and the voice is beautiful. Note there as well, I haven't had any problem, I don't mind at all, moving my word order around. For English, I haven't said, and beautiful is the voice in my English translation. That's not very natural English word order. Greek doesn't have the issues that we have to have about word order because of the way that its agreement works, I can turn that word order around so that it makes sense in English as well. So, and the voice is beautiful. So our next sentence. Exaipnes, den agroi esti thea. So exaipnes was the other one of the words that you hadn't met in the videos with their practice sentences before you tackled this. Perhaps my overacting has given you a hint as to what it means. I apologize for the overacting, but it is one of my favorite words in Greek simply because of how cool I think it sounds. Exaipnes. It means suddenly. And then we have de again, another conjunction. Here we could translate de because there's no men causing any form of contrast. We could translate it but, or we could translate it and. It can do either of those roles when it's just sort of joining on a sentence without a strong contrast with the men. We have en agroi again. We know what that means. We've got esti again. We're very familiar with that. We've got thea at the end of the line. That's our feminine nominative singular subject. So here we have suddenly in the field there is a goddess. If we want to keep the there, we might say something like and suddenly in the field there is a goddess. Greek uses conjunctions a little more perhaps than English does, certainly English these days, and so we can omit conjunctions if it reads more naturally in English for us to do so. Here's our next sentence. Estin her Athene. I'm sure you had no problems with this at all. We're very familiar with estin now. It's been the most common verb in the sentence, and her Athene is a proper name. We can tell that because of the capital letter. One thing worth noting about this, though, when we have estin at the start of a sentence or a clause, it's quite emphatic. It is. So we want, it is obviously Athena as our subject. We want to get that sense of it is Athena. So suddenly in the field there's a goddess, it is Athena. Our next sentence, Hod angelos ten thean taumazde. So we've got our subject as our first word here. That doesn't always happen in Greek. We've seen it come right at the very end a couple of times now, but here we've got it back in word order that we'd be familiar with in English. We've got ten tean, that's an accusative form, and here it's the object of the verb. Now, the verb taumazde, third person singular, subject is ho angelos, you will remember means I wonder at. In English, when we translate it, we want to add a preposition in it, I wonder at something. But Greek treats it as a transitive verb, so it can govern a direct object. So we can simply translate that as the messenger wonders at the goddess, or we might say is amazed at the goddess, or even is in awe of the goddess, something along those lines. Kai he Athene lege, aner kalos kai agathos ei. So Kai we're familiar with now, and he Athene we're very happy translating because it's simply her name. Remember, we only use capital letters for proper names in Greek. We don't, as we do in, say, English, start sentences with them. So we've got Lego, I speak. So Lego, she says. When you have direct speech, which is what we've got coming up after our colon with our inverted commas, be prepared to get first and second person verbs. I know that sounds like a really obvious thing, but it can be very easy once you've translated a big long passage with third person verb after third person verb. So, oh, what is that? Oh, yes, it's a first or a second person verb. And be ready for that, because obviously when we talk, we tend to talk about ourselves to other people. So we'll need the first and the second person as well as the third person there. And indeed, we have a second person singular verb there with a from the verb to be again. Anerman. Kalos kai agathos, two adjectives, kalos fine and agathos good. This little phrase, kalos kai agathos, or sometimes it's run together and the kai is kind of smushed into the front of the agathos, kalos kagathos. That's called krasis. That's quite a common phrase in Greek thought. It was a very sort of admirable thing to be and to want to be described as a kalos kai agathos, a fine person and a good one. So Athena says to our messenger, you are a fine and good man. And Athena says, you are a fine and good man. And finally, kaidura to angeloi pareche. So, kai, our conjunction, very familiar with that. Dora. Now, Dora, you remember, comes from doron, which is a neuter second declension noun meaning gift. Here we've got Dora, the plural, could be nominative, could be accusative, because with neuter in the singular and the plural, the nominative and accusative forms are the same. So we need to work out which one of those two it is. So how are we going to go about doing that? Well, we can look at the rest of the sentence now. In some cases, when we have an ambiguity between whether a form is accusative or nominative, we can look to the verb. That can help solve that. For example, the noun nous has the same nominative singular and accusative plural. But as we said earlier, neuter plurals take singular verbs. Parece, that's a third person singular verb, so that doesn't help us solve this. If we had parece and it was a second person singular, then we could think, well, you don't tend to talk to gifts, and even if you did, it'd be a bit weird there, so that's probably not going to be the subject. But here we've got an ambiguity, so we're going to have to think about this in a different way. So we've got a third person singular verb, and we've also got toi angeloi. So let's think about toi angeloi. So I look at that, toi and angeloi, with the omega and the iota subscript. I know that's dative, that ending, but I don't have a preposition. Okay, and whereas before with the dative agoroi we had the preposition en, meaning in, I don't have one there. So with my verb parece, as I said, third person singular form from pareco. Pareco means I provide, and very often with pareco you get a construction where you provide something that's in the accusative to someone or something else that's in the dative. So that helps me solve my toi angeloi. That's an indirect object. So that means that my Dora is likely to be the direct object of the verb. So, and the gift to the end, to the messenger, provides. Well, who's providing? And this is the thing that I mentioned earlier. Very often in Greek, once a subject's been said, if the subject doesn't change, then it doesn't get mentioned again. We simply understand it from the previous sentence, and that's what we need to do here. We need to think Athena is the subject of the verb, and then we can just use the pronoun she, and she provides gifts to the messenger. So I'll just go through the whole passage again, just read the translation out, just so you can follow that along. In a field is a good messenger. The messenger hears a voice, but the field is deserted, and the voice is beautiful. Suddenly, in the field, there is a goddess. It is Athena, and the messenger is amazed at the goddess. And Athena says, "You are a fine and good man," and she provides gifts to the messenger. So that's the whole passage. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Greek myth, and so you'll know that this is quite an unusual story. Normally gods don't arrive, reveal who they are, and do nice things for you. Generally they arrive in disguise and something goes horribly wrong. But here we have, for once, a happy ending. For more resources on ancient Greek, please visit our website, www.greeksummerschool.org.